This is Igor Kurchatov, the father of the Soviet atomic bomb. And this is Efim Slavsky, who will rise to become the director of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, which oversaw the Soviet nuclear industry. And this is Josef Stalin, then leader of the USSR. In 1949, the Soviet Union will cause Igor Kurchatov's death in a nuclear accident that likely had more direct fatalities than the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. This is the story of how that happened. If you ever thought the RBMK design was poor, you'll love the reactor involved in this story. Simply titled Reactor A, it was housed within this unassuming building by the river Teacher. You may be wondering where the reactor is, and the answer is well below ground. This design was made, in part, by someone mentioned regularly on this channel for his efforts in designing the RBMK, Nikolai Dolezal. If you thought his interest in graphite-moderated reactors was a fluke, hold on to your hats because this design is crazy. Now, the full pit for Reactor A extends 54 meters below the ground, and the active zone of the reactor, where the fission actually occurs, was a cylinder 9.2 meters high and 9.2 meters in diameter. 150 tons of uranium in 83,000 blocks were placed in 1,150 channels drilled through the cylinder, made out of 1,050 tons of graphite. Reactor A used natural uranium, about 0.7% enriched, and was intended to operate at a maximum of 100 megawatts, but is more or less like an RBMK in design, with a few differences. Water flowed through technological channels around the fuel, from the bottom to the top, but only exited the reactor at 96 degrees Celsius. A steel structure below and above the reactor acted as biological shields, and several meter thick concrete surrounding the reactor on the outside allowed for maintenance while the reactor was running, and fuel was loaded while the reactor was still running from above and removed out the bottom. The first person to operate the reactor was Igor Kurchatov himself, on June 8, 1948. Interestingly, when he handed the controls over to the next person, he signed a very unusual note. To the shift supervisors, I warn you that if the water stops, there will be an explosion. Therefore, the apparatus must not be left without water under any circumstances. IV Kurchatov. Of course, these things never go well. On June 19th, the very first day the reactor was operated at full power, the uranium in channel 1720 sintered to the graphite blocks, as a valve was improperly lined, meaning that the uranium did not receive coolant, and the aluminium channel exploded. It took 11 days to shut down the reactor, clean out the channel by drilling through the graphite blocks to get what had been nicknamed a goat, and at this point Kurchatov wrote another note. To the shift supervisors, I warn you that if the working and idle water stops, there will be an explosion at the same time. Therefore, the apparatus cannot be left without water under any circumstances. I asked the director of the reactor plant to familiarise those workers on whom this depends with this information and sign a notice. While operation of this reactor was crazy, the real craziness came from the reprocessing of these uranium blocks into the plutonium for the bomb. The chimney was the tallest in the USSR at the time, and one of the least stable, rocking 2 to 3 meters in the wind at the top, sending convicts hurtling to their deaths every day during construction. Oh yeah, if I didn't mention, this entire site was built by convicts, headed by Lavrenti Beria. Beria is, in case you didn't know, a horrible person, but that is not the scope of this video. All you need to know is Kurchatov answers to Beria, and Beria desperately needs a nuclear bomb to please Stalin. The processing of the uranium blocks to extract the plutonium required nitric acid to dissolve it, and the nitric acid escaped out of the chimney, with a lot of radiation. trees around the site began to die, but no records of human exposure to radiation were ever recorded. People were expendable at Chelyabinsk 40, and as it would be proved later, even Kurchatov himself. Speaking of Kurchatov, he was having perhaps too much fun at Reactor A, sitting behind L, a woman operating the reactor, and they got very, very close to having an affair. Kurchatov staying at her apartment while drinking Soviet champagne, but stopped short due to his marriage. L would then get married to another engineer and have a child, which Kurchatov missed due to business in Moscow. When Kurchatov returned, he was not invited in, and they refused his help. Kurchatov fell into a depressed state, knowing his chance of having a child died with L's marriage. At the top of the pecking order at Chelyabinsk was Efim Slavsky, the 50-year-old chief engineer overseeing the operation of the reactor. He had to deal with the June goat and another goat in July, and then, in November that year, things started to go horribly wrong. Now, before I begin this section, I'm going to point something out. All of the sources I have read here, from Slavsky's memoirs to books about Chelyabinsk to the biography of Igor Kurchatov, all diverge here. This is the best reassembly of these events I have, gathered from all the sources. It begins on November 5th, when a blizzard hit Chelyabinsk 40. This dragged a load of sludge into the water intake of the reactor, and then ripped the water intake out of the lake bed. The reactor was shut down until November 7th, as the Soviet Union called in every diver it could to fix the intake. Lavrenti Beria was getting really unhappy now. Where was his plutonium? Again, on January 10th, the reactor had to be stopped. The aluminium channels of the reactor were becoming so corroded by the water and graphite and radiation in the reactor that they could no longer safely function. Between January 12th and 13th, they tried to raise the power again, but it wasn't safe to do so. And then before they shut down, some of the aluminium tubing failed, leaking water into the graphite stack. Beria then sent another letter to Chelyabinsk, demanding his plutonium. Kurchatov didn't answer the letter. The solution to their problems was simple. Line the aluminium channels with a film to prevent their oxidation. But they didn't have the uranium required to reload the reactor. The blocks in the core, containing plutonium they needed, were also potentially damaged by the aluminium corrosion, and there wasn't enough uranium in the Soviet Union to freshly load the reactor. The solution seemed to be simple. Take out the blocks, discard the broken ones, and reload the undamaged uranium. But then, at the worst possible time, the exact moment something could not go wrong, the worst conceivable thing happened. The loading machines broke. They were cut into pieces and removed, but now they were faced with a difficult question. Option 1. Wait for the machine to be repaired, removing all the fuel and aluminium, and discard it all and start again. Meanwhile, Beria is breathing down their necks, demanding his plutonium, and if they're not careful, they could end up convicts like many of those working there. The second option was to remove the fuel without waiting. Using suckers at the top of the core, you can suck the fuel out, and sometimes the entire aluminium tube with it. Disassemble the structure to find the blocks, and inspect each one individually for damage, to reduce the amount of new uranium needed. The decision fell to a few people we've come across before on our channel. Kurchatov and Slavsky, as well as Zvenyagin, who would propose what became the Tsar bomber, and the director of the reactor plant. And of course, Beria forcing their hand. They went with option 2. Every single man in Chelyabinsk 40 was drafted for the operation, convict or otherwise. And then they went into the reactor hall, sucking the fuel out of the top. Immediately, highly radioactive noble gases were released into the hull, spiking the radiation doses. The aluminium pipe would be cut open to expose the 74 or so blocks of uranium in a channel, and pick them up and drop them into buckets of water. The water was necessary because of how hot the blocks were, not just radioactively, but also physically, as the uranium burned with radioactive decay, about 65 microcuries, or 2 million disintegrations a second, per block. The buckets provided some shielding, as they were carried out of the building to be visually inspected for damage, and then either sent to be prepared for reloading, or to be used to extract what plutonium was in the block. Payment was organised by number of blocks removed. The more work you did, the more you received. Kurchatov and Zvenyagin participated in the efforts. Slavsky did not. He was advised against it. In fact, for Kurchatov, this was ironically the best fitting job he had. With experience in Moscow on prototype plutonium-producing reactors, he knew what damage was catastrophic for a uranium block. So, not only did he step into the reactor hull, but he also combed over hundreds of uranium blocks. Zvenyagin would also assist in this. It's unknown how many shifts Kurchatov worked through, although there is a record of one of his dosimeters from one of these shifts, with an estimated 42 rongens of exposure. We also know that, to stop people being removed from work due to high exposure, the leadership of Chelyabinsk 40 removed the dosimeters of the workers before they entered high radiation zones, and we can presume that Kurchatov also would have done this, as would Zvenyagin. Zvenyagin died in 1956. Another scientist worth mentioning is Boris Nikitin, who also oversaw the sorting of the defective uranium, but also the processing of it, which would have been manageable had all the radioactive blocks not been stored close to his workplace. Nikitin suffered from acute radiation poisoning, leading to chronic illnesses, and a sudden death in July of 1952. He was 46. Work at Nikitin's processing plant also went horribly wrong. The first attempt to remove the aluminium from the damaged blocks used the wrong catalyst, and the concentration of radioactive liquid became 100 times larger than they had anticipated, with nowhere to put it. Much ended up in the Teacher River. Solutions were transferred using substandard pipelines, leading to radioactive spills and contamination of workers. The number of scientists leaving due to radiation illnesses skyrocketed. For his part, Beria pressured an aviation factory to produce the new aluminium pipes with the new coating, and made sure it was ready by the time the reactor was ready to be reloaded, some 39 days and 39,000 blocks later. The old blocks were reloaded in the core with the new ones as well, and the reactor was again started back up. And, in one last backstab from the same people who forced them into a radioactive hell, the payment of all workers was cut in half. But now they were really behind on plutonium production, and Beria was getting very angry. Kurchatov decided to do what many considered the most dangerous thing possible: raise the power of the reactor from 100 megawatts to 175 megawatts. More fission, and so more plutonium produced, but it was never going to be enough for Beria. Another goat appeared in channel 2006. The reactor had to be stopped so they could drill into it, but they chose not to, and kept the reactor running, until it had 5 of these damaged channels, and it was still running at 175 megawatts. In February of 1949, the processing plant had their first plutonium. By August, they had enough to assemble a large sphere of plutonium metal, to be used in RDS-1, a near-identical clone of the US Fat Man implosion device. Explosives are used to compress the plutonium sphere into a small enough area that it undergoes fission, blowing itself apart. Some 6.4 kilograms of plutonium was needed for this, and it was quickly shipped from Chelyabinsk to Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, where the explosion was scheduled to be detonated. August 29th, 1949. The Soviets joined the nuclear arms race with RDS-1. The bomb had an explosive yield of 20 kilotons, and was 3 years ahead of American expectations. When Truman heard the news, he was lost for words. They had not been aware of the leak of their own weapon design schemes to their ideological enemy. Meanwhile, the work at Chelyabinsk was accelerating, with 4 more reactors being built to produce plutonium. The first of these, Reactor B, was signed off on December 30th, 1949, with Igor Kurchatov noting the high-quality building, which it really wasn't, in order to spare innocent prisoners from punishment. Operators grew complacent, accidents became commonplace, and now Kurchatov was under pressure from Stalin to race for the hydrogen bomb, where he saw some ghastly things, including the deaths of 2 of his colleagues by decompression, Bardin and Barishev, when handling irradiated lithium to get tritium for a hydrogen bomb. And then, Stalin died. The pressure on Kurchatov was lifted. Beria, who had pressured him for almost a decade to build their atomic bomb, was executed for his many crimes. And Kurchatov began to advocate for peace at the Soviet Academy of Sciences and around the world, including at Geneva. And 5 years after his exposure, the radiation Kurchatov received when forced to buy Beria and others caught up to him, and he became much weaker physically, battling illnesses. And then, at the end of May 1956, Kurchatov had a stroke. 2 months later, he was back to campaigning for peaceful use of nuclear power. In February of 1957, he had a second stroke. In June of 1957, Slavsky became the minister for the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, and a month later, the now infamous Mayak disaster occurred. At the time, Anatoly Alexandrov, the up-and-coming scientist who would lead the Academy of Sciences for decades to come, having already served 3 terms, requested Kurchatov propose an interdepartmental control over the design and operation of reactors, but Kurchatov was now too ill to fight for it, and those like Slavsky resisted it. A 55-year-old childless Kurchatov, short of breath and requiring a stick for mobility after his 2 strokes. All he had left now was work. And even then, he was barely strong enough to do it. In 1960, he only gave 1 speech in January. On February 5th, he listened to Mozart's Requiem, performed by the Moscow Philharmonic Orchestra for the first time, and spoke to his wife about how motivated to live he was. The next day he went to walk, and went to sit down on a bench with another nuclear physicist. When his friend looked over, Kurchatov was dead. He had a 3rd blood clot break free, but instead of travelling to his brain, it went to his heart. Kurchatov was cremated, and his ashes entombed in the wall of the Kremlin Wall necropolis. Kurchatov's life was ruined by his radiation exposure. In 1949. His radiation dosage was not immediately fatal, but he received a great enough dose to damage most of his body, including his bone marrow, leading to several blood illnesses and the clots that caused his untimely fate, as well as several masses that had to be surgically removed before his death. This is a quote from Slavsky's memoirs, published years after his death. For him, the liquidation of the failure was fatal. He paid a cruel price for our atomic bomb. It was fortunate he did not take part to the finish in the sorting out of the elements. If he'd stayed in the hall till the end, we would have lost him. Many would die for that plutonium, when the Soviet government decided waiting for a few weeks was worth less than thousands of lives, including many convicts. The number of actual fatalities is unknown, but can be presumed to be in the hundreds, including people like Kurchatov and Zvenyagin, and Nikitin. Slavsky would be the minister of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building for the next 30 years, and oversaw many accidents, including both Mayak and Chernobyl. Aside from Reactor A, there were 2 more reactors built at the site, named B and C, as well as the superior AV-1 and AV-2, which operated from 1950 to 1989 and 1951 to 1990 respectively. Reactor A finally closed in 1987, after being upgraded to operate at 500 megawatts. Much of the waste produced by this reactor ended up in Lake Karachi, now considered to be the most polluted place on Earth. Information about the reactors at Chelyabinsk 40 continues to remain scarce to this day.